In the final centuries of the BC era, the Roman Republic had found friendship in the Hellenistic confederation known as the Achaean League. Having shared a bond since the Second Macedonian War, the Romans and the Achaeans made a remarkable team, or at least they had for a while. As things often go in ancient Rome, this alliance had reached its peak, and the trip downhill was quick and rocky. Internal struggles within the Achaean League and debate over just how involved it should allow Rome to be in its affairs were early signs of the coming breakup. Rome would also stir the pot after taking thousands of Achaean hostages during the Third Macedonian War, a decision they became set in defending despite pressure from the Achaeans to release the hostages. Ever-evolving disputations continued to thus exacerbate these growing problems. While Rome had to focus on the Fourth Macedonian War and the Third Punic War, the Achaeans were distracted by a more personal conflict with Sparta, something Rome also eyed diligently. In short order, with the Third Punic War coming to an end, Rome began to pay even more heedful attention to what was happening over in Greece, and a new push to minimize the growing power of the Achaean League would take tensions to a whole new level. Rapidly reaching their breaking point with Rome's meddling, the Greeks reacted much stronger than the Romans had anticipated. The Achaean League declared war on Sparta. Whether the Achaeans had also declared war on the Roman Republic or not is unknown. Either way, the Greeks knew that the act of striking Sparta alone would put them face to face with their former allies, and warring with the Romans would be far from easy. The initial answer from the Republic was to send two separate armies to put a brisk end to the Achaeans' impermissible war. The first army to arrive, under Quintus Caecilius Metellus Macedonicus, would march intrepidly toward Critolaus and his Achaean army, which were currently laying siege to Heraclea in Trachis. Receiving word of the nearing Romans, Critolaus attempted to retreat, but was caught by Macedonicus at Scarphaea, where a hasty battle unfolded. The following death of Critolaus, not by sword or spear, but either by poison or drowning, caused the Achaeans to stumble in their response to the attacking Roman armies. Some members of the League opted to impulsively surrender to the Romans, though others chose instead to support a continued fight against the Republic led by a new figure in Critolaus's place, Diaius. And now, as Diaius was dauntlessly rallying his own forces, Rome's Second Army, under the command of Lucius Mummius Achaicus, began devising an attack on Corinth. Diaius's 650 cavalry and 13,500 strong infantry were impressive, but less so in humble comparison to Mummius's 3,500 cavalry and 23,000 strong infantry. The Achaeans had a chance, but a chance was nothing of a kind with an assured victory. The armies had been prepared for a magnificent clash, but instead, Diaius had chicken-heartedly run off, mercilessly murdering his wife and taking his own life in Megalopolis, abandoning the Achaean troops and, as a horrible consequence, losing Corinth entirely. Many from the city had moreover fled, whilst those who didn't were either massacred in the case of the men or enslaved in that of the women and children. The rest of the Achaeans subsequently crumbled at the feet of the unconquerable Romans. While some autonomy would remain due to the way the Republic chose to reorganize the region, there was no doubt now just how involved Rome would be in Achaean affairs, and it would be quite a lot. It wasn't just the Greeks whom Rome was meddling with, however. The Republic had long been grappling for control in the Iberian Peninsula, and not long after the resolution of the Achaean War, a new conflict erupted with the Celtiberians. Repeated spats between the Romans and Celtiberians had plagued the prior decades, and it was now the people of Numantia who attempted to challenge Roman control in the peninsula. The conflict was grueling for both sides and started only a few years after the Republic had bested the Achaeans, then lasting until 133 BC when the Romans, by the hand of the champion of Carthage Scipio, managed to essentially starve the Numantines into surrender. All while this was going on, the Romans had additionally been fighting to quash the Lusitanians of Hispania Ulterior, something they came up successfully from shortly before putting a final conclusive end to the rebellions by the Celtiberians. And yet still, these were not all of the pivotal events that occurred during the 130s BC. In fact, one remarkable occurrence during this period was the stunning act by the final king of Pergamon, Attalus III, who handed over the whole of his kingdom to the Roman Republic. The exceptional virtue of this development stood in stark contrast to another event of the period: the murder of Tiberius Gracchus. Gracchus had earned himself the office of Tribune of the Plebs, a position that allowed him to preside over the People's Assembly and pass agrarian reforms that were fatally unpopular with members of the Senate. It would be his gallant bid for re-election as tribune, however, that would push his enemies to the fanatical. Gracchus and his supporters were thus ruthlessly beaten to death by a vicious mob riled up by the tribune's cousin, Publius Cornelius Scipio Nasica. The tragedy was unfortunate, but not all that scarce in Rome, though still a bit of a damper on the Republic's recent successes. The following years would furthermore be fairly routine: organization of territories, new laws passed, and by 112 BC, another significant international conflict. Ever since the Third Punic War, the Romans had found a sound ally in the North African kingdom of Numidia. A former neighbor to Carthage, King Massinissa of Numidia had been a friend to the Roman Republic, and it was assumed that his son and successor, Micipsa, would be as well. King Micipsa thus never proved to be a problem for the Romans, at least until he died. Upon his unsuitable passing, he left behind 3 potential heirs to the kingdom. In hopes of resolving this predicament, specifically worried that his nephew would seize the throne from his sons, Micipsa had adopted his nephew, Jugurtha, and declared both of his sons, Adherbal and Hypsal I and Jugurtha, to be his rightful heirs. The trio was subsequently meant to rule together upon the king's passing, although this cooperation was depressingly short-lived. The immediate resolution was supposed to be a dividing of Numidia into 3 separate kingdoms, but this proved to be difficult and led to open warfare between the relatives. The end result would be the untimely death of both of Micipsa's biological sons and the massacre of Roman citizens who had aided Adherbal, prompting Rome to reluctantly declare war. The Jugurthine War was one of corruption, inconsistency, and was driven by heightening anger from the people of Rome who saw through the immorality. Initially, Jugurtha had persuaded members of the Roman Senate to grant him a remarkably kind peace deal, but soon more pleas by the people of the Republic forced Rome to call off the unscrupulous treaty. Military conflict was then back on, but Roman surrender followed, as would a peace deal made by Spurius Postumius Albinus, yet not acknowledged by the Senate. In response, Quintus Metellus was sent to lead the Roman army instead, and the war was back on yet again. The Roman campaign was now carrying on adequately, but swelling internal struggles between Metellus and his lieutenant-turned-successor Gaius Marius began to crack its foundation. This time, there would come a lasting conclusion to the war. Thanks to the father-in-law of Jugurtha, Bocchus, the Numidian king was soon brought to Roman quaestor Lucius Cornelius Sulla in chains, disgracefully defeated, and now mortifyingly a prisoner. His men were massacred, and kingdom gifted to his half-brother and Bocchus. The real victor of this clash, in contrast then, was Gaius Marius. The man would go on to earn 7 consulships, 5 of them occurring consecutively. He would also institute a series of revolutionary military changes referred to as the Marian Reforms. These changes were implemented in 107 BC and remained almost entirely untouched until the ultimate collapse of the Roman Empire. A few years prior to Marius's reforms, nevertheless, the Roman military would be used yet again. This time, it was back to brawling with the Celts, these ones of Germanic origin. A period known as the Cimbrian War saw an invasion of Roman-controlled territory by the Cimbri and Teutons, and by 101 BC had pushed to Italy itself. The Romans would come out triumphant, and the Cimbri in particular nearly wiped off the face of the earth by the end of it all. It was beginning to look like the Romans were undefeatable, and yet it was around this same time that domestic contention began to chip away at the strength of the Republic. Slave rebellions would be some of the biggest challenges of this time, as the Romans found it increasingly difficult to keep a handle on some of their lower-class residents. Sicily in 135 BC would be the scene of the First Servile War, one of these such troubling revolts. This particular war had a wildly peculiar trigger. A slave by the name of Eunice claimed to be a prophet, and with the help of his growing supporters, fellow slaves, he craftily managed to capture the city of Enna. Eunice and his new commander, Cilician slave Cleon, then went on to wage a full-blown campaign of rebellion against the Roman Republic, something that the Roman army early on labored to stamp out. Even after laying siege to the slave-controlled cities in 134 BC, it took roughly 2 more years for the rebellion to finally come to an end. And still, Round 2 would come in 104 BC, when the Republic reversed a decision to have all slaves from Roman allies freed. This, quite understandably, sent unbridled fury through the ranks of these hundreds of slaves, who thus revolted. This second servile war also played out within Sicily's borders, and once more made it progressively difficult for the Romans to quell the growing mutiny. After 3 years, the slaves would again, at length, be defeated. But this repeated altercation and the struggle it took for the Republic to best their challengers, albeit a band of angry slaves, was beginning to shine a glaringly bright light on the weaknesses within Rome's structure. This came in startling contrast to its earlier victories and displays of great power, marking a magnifying decline of the Roman Republic. There would be, in due course, a third servile war in 73 BC that would show the true progress of ruinous erosion happening within the Republic, but not before another tussle, known as the Social War. Beginning in 91 BC, this was more treacherous than a slave rebellion. It was a war on friends. A clash between the Roman Republic and a hurtful some of its allies. These longtime friends of the Republic were growing increasingly unsatisfied with their positions as lesser status, lacking Roman citizenship, and all that comes along with it. Rome was repulsed by this idea, only displeasing their allies further, who would not back down on this new demand for equality. As often was the case when discord rang out in the vicinity of Rome, the situation inevitably turned to warfare. These hostilities would last for 4 years in total, and by the end of it, Rome had both won and lost. On the one hand, they managed to maintain decent relations with their comrades, as some surrendered and others simply chose to remain loyal. And yet, on the other hand, they lost, because the only way to make the first part true was for the Republic to finally agree to their allies' demands and grant citizenship to all residents of peninsular Italy. Nevertheless, life went on, and there were still ever-growing problems at home that needed Roman attention. A few years after the debacle with the Republic's allies, one of Rome's own stirred up a new plight. The man who had been handed the king of Numidia in chains, Lucius Cornelius Sulla, marched on the capital of the Republic with one thing in mind: ultimate power. Sulla first seized control in Rome back in 88 BC, but shortly left to fight the First Mithridatic War against rebellious Greek cities led by King Mithridates VI of Pontus. After the Roman victory a few years later, Sulla audaciously marched back to Rome to continue pursuing his goals at home. While the challenger had been gone, he had left a trusted ally, Gnaeus Octavius, in his place at the helm of the Roman Republic. This substitute was later ousted by the exiled Gaius Marius, his son, and fellow opponent to Sulla, Lucius Cornelius Cinna. The successful opposition then massacred supporters of Sulla, and Marius and Cinna officially declared themselves to now be in the positions that Sulla had claimed for himself. Marius's days, however, were numbered, leaving Cinna on his own as the ruler of Rome and the sole adversary to the returning and impassioned Sulla. An army under Lucius Valerius Flaccus was sent to meet up with Sulla and relieve him from his duties in the east, leading to Sulla winning over a handful of Flaccus's troops before he could reach his destination. By the time he landed in southern Italy, Sulla's forces would multiply even more as his old supporters, at least those who had avoided slaughter, flocked to his side yet again. The first battle of what would later be deemed Sulla's civil war thus came in 83 BC, with the Battle of Mount Tifata, a clash that Sulla would easily win. Negotiations, more defections, and further battles would follow over the next few months, and the war would drag on until Sulla emerged victorious in 82 BC, crowning himself as dictator of the Roman Republic. While the new despot of the Roman Republic was busy gaining his title, Lucius Licinius Murena was locked in a second Mithridatic War against Mithridates VI of Pontus, a conflict that would persist until an inconclusive pause was put on hostilities in 81 BC. Rome was doing as Rome does, fighting war after war after war, fighting to maintain their power and supremacy in spite of corruption, internal strife, and general growing instability. The decade following Sulla's campaign to take Rome for himself would be marred by the Sertorian War, the Third Mithridatic War, and the Third Servile War. The first of these contests began in 80 BC and was yet another rebellion, this time sparked by a group of Roman, Celtic, Iberian, and other rebels who opposed Sulla's new authority. Quintus Sertorius, the namesake of the war, had been an opposition fighter during Sulla's civil war, and now led the new hostilities against the dictator. The conflict would last for 8 draining years, overlapping with the unrelated campaigns as it played out on the Iberian Peninsula. The light at the end of the tunnel could only be found when disloyalty within the opposition led Marcus Perperna to murder his alleged ally, Sertorius. Perperna was less of a challenge than his victim had been for Rome, and the great Pompey was quick to put an end to him as well. This was just in time, as the Republic was now fighting on two additional fronts. Over in Asia Minor, Rome was yet again facing off with Mithridates in what would be the largest and longest of the Mithridatic Wars, lasting a grueling 10 years and pulling allies from multiple continents into the bloodshed. It was another damaging event for the quivering Republic. And it wasn't all that Rome had to deal with. Also in 73 BC, the third and most famous of the Servile Wars broke out when 70 gladiators found freedom after escaping a gladiator school. It wasn't hard for these former slaves to stir up support amongst peers, and it wouldn't be long before their rebellious ranks reached over 100,000. Possibly the most famous of the gladiator force's leaders was Spartacus, who became impeccable at fending off Roman armies to continue his revolt. His motives and what he aimed for as his end goal of the rebellion are widely debated by modern and even older historic tellings. Whatever it may be, Spartacus and his troops seemed unstoppable, at least until Marcus Licinius Crassus took command of the Roman side. The Roman army found Crassus to be much more petrifying than the enemy itself, and thus this fear violently pushed them to triumph. The Republic was finally able to crush the third and last Servile rebellion, and Crassus, with the help of Pompey, who was on his way back to Italy from the expedition in the Mithridatic War, ensured the utter decimation of the rebellious slaves. It's believed that Spartacus himself was one of these casualties. Ever since the end of the Third Punic War, two things had been true about the Roman Republic. Try as it might, it was plagued by military conflict, and it was collapsing like a sandcastle under high tide with each strike of the sword. By the mid-1st century BC, there was little hope left for the Republic, and the Romans knew it. And one man, born at the turn of the century, would be the final piece in the crumbling puzzle: Julius Caesar.